If suddenly the oil flow from Canada to the US, the lifeblood of American energy, were to be cut off, who would pay the price, the US, the government, or the everyday people before tariffs were imposed? The energy relationship between the US, Canada, and Mexico was essentially a life-sustaining cycle. While the US extracts a lot of oil, it still can't fully self-supply. That's a truth few know. Canada pumps nearly 8 million barrels of oil into the US every day. More than half of the country's total oil imports. Mexico also plays a key role, particularly with heavy crude oil fuel that many US refineries are designed to process. Thanks to this oil flow from the North and South, Americans can still fill up their tanks at affordable prices, and industrial states can keep their manufacturing lines running on the flip side. Canada relies on revenue from oil. Alberta, the cold region in the west, contributes a large portion of Canada's GDP by exporting oil to the US in Mexico. Oil is the industry that sustains hundreds of thousands of jobs, particularly in coastal states where oil tankers come in and out constantly. When the US imposed a 25% tariff on goods from Canada, the first question that crossed my mind was, would Canada dare to touch oil? And as it turns out, not only did they dare, they were ready to use oil as a strategic weapon with over 8 million barrels flowing into the US refinery system each day. Even a small portion being held back would have states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota starting to feel the strain. I lived in Detroit for a few months, a place where the auto factories run day and night. When gas prices rise, it's not just commuters that are affected. The entire supporting industry feels the pain. And if Canada were to cut off oil, places like Detroit would be the first to speak up. Why did Canada choose oil instead of just retaliating with tariffs? Because oil is something the US can't replace right away. Refineries in the Midwest and Gulf are designed to handle heavy oil from Alberta, not light oil from Texas or the Middle East. If Canada stops exporting, the US won't have an affordable and compatible replacement. In the next 2,003 weeks, this move doesn't just cause technical trouble, it creates massive psychological pressure on the US energy market. At the same time, Canada is also considering reintroducing retaliatory tariffs, just as they did in 2018. I clearly remember that year. Canada imposed tariffs on bourbon from Kentucky, orange juice from Florida, and steel from Pennsylvania. They didn't need to damage entire industries. Just hitting the states with electoral clout was enough to make Congress take notice. But what's even more significant to me is how Canada has gradually started to move away from US dependency. They are expanding the Trans-Mountain pipeline system to reach the Pacific, looking for new customers in China and India, countries that aren't too concerned with what Washington thinks. One day, if Canada fully shifts gears, the energy retaliation won't just be temporary, it'll be permanent. If Canada really cuts its oil exports by 30% in just 2 weeks, I'm sure gas and electricity prices in the US will rise by 5 to 10%, and in some places even more if strategic reserves aren't enough. Some experts predict that US industrial revenue could drop by 3 to 5%, not just because of higher electricity prices, but also due to delayed export orders, partly due to cost, and partly because the energy supply chain won't be stable. Personally, I think of it more simply: a full tank of gas today could cost an extra $5, and next month's electric bill could rise by $15. But for a transportation company or a factory using hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel every month, that's a loss of hundreds of thousands of dollars in just 1 quarter. America's 50% tariff on European goods sent shockwaves worth $2 trillion through the global economy and cost Boeing a massive $43 billion deal. But how does this impact you, the consumer, when President Trump slapped a 50% tariff on imports from Europe? The immediate effects weren't just felt in Europe, they hit American exporters hard. 2 major US industries like automobiles, steel, and agriculture suddenly found themselves facing higher tariffs from the EU. The result: higher production costs and a loss of competitive edge on the world stage. Take the US car industry. For example, General Motors and Ford are now forced to sell cars at much higher prices in Europe thanks to the added tariff costs. This means declining sales, shrinking market share, and rising costs. And it's not just the automakers. American consumers are also feeling the pinch, with domestic car prices on the rise as supply chains get disrupted. It doesn't end with cars. Steel and aluminum companies like US Steel are also seeing major shifts. The EU, once a huge customer, is now turning to other suppliers like Canada, China, and South Korea due to the steep tariffs. Slowly but surely, the US is being edged out of global supply chains as products become less competitive on price. The agricultural sector isn't escaping either. Items like butter, cheese, and beef, big sellers in Europe, are now facing hefty tariffs. US products are simply too expensive to compete with local goods or those from countries with better trade deals. With the EU causing exports to drop sharply through the CDA agreement, EU and Canada have eliminated 98% of tariffs between them, creating a trade environment that's more open, transparent, and less politically risky, while the US builds walls. Canada opens its doors, and European businesses are shifting their focus northward away from America. Boeing, America's largest aerospace company, has taken a huge blow after the EU cancelled a $43 billion deal with the company. This loss is massive, especially since Boeing relies on international contracts to stay afloat with Ryanair, one of Boeing's biggest customers. Reconsidering its 737 MAX orders, Boeing could lose even more revenue. This isn't just a problem for Boeing, it's a wake-up call for the entire US aerospace industry. As Boeing loses a massive deal with the EU, its main rival, Airbus, is stepping in to grab market share. Airbus's stock is soaring while Boeing's is on the decline. This could shake investor confidence and make it harder for Boeing to raise capital. It's not just companies that are feeling the heat. The fallout from this tariff war is trickling down to American consumers' products imported from the EU. Things like cars, food, and everyday goods are going to cost more due to higher tariffs. This is going to hit consumers in the pocketbook, especially those with lower or middle incomes. The rising cost of food and cars is going to increase the overall cost of living for Americans. American farmers, especially those producing dairy, cheese, and beef, will bear the brunt of the EU's tariffs on these products. Cancelled or reduced export contracts mean many farms will face financial struggles. Layoffs and production cuts similarly. Workers in the car and steel industries may see job losses as exports drop. As a result of the tariff war, the EU and Canada have signed agreements that eliminate up to 98% of tariffs, opening the door to a new trade framework. By 2026, trade between the EU and Canada is expected to top $90 billion annually, showing a significant shift in Europe's strategy. And it's not just traditional goods. Clean tech trade between the EU and Canada has grown by 41% from last year, especially in renewable energy, hydrogen, and battery technologies. This is more than just an opportunity for businesses. It's a signal that Europe and Canada are building a sustainable green economy together. Tesla requested a $43 million subsidy from Canada, and just days later it was removed from the entire electric vehicle. Program sales in Quebec dropped by over 85%. Stocks took a nosedive. How will consumers pay the price for this? On March 25, 2025, the Canadian government officially announced the suspension of all support for Tesla, including removing the company from future electric vehicle incentive programs. This decision didn't come out of nowhere. It followed only weeks after the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on goods imported from Canada, marking the beginning of a series of retaliatory measures between the two longtime allies. Canada didn't Need to call out Elon Musk by name, but choosing Tesla as the target sent a clear political signal. Within 3 months of the suspension, Tesla's market share in Quebec plummeted from 45% to just 10%. The province had been a key market for the company, where each Model 3 was generously subsidized, allowing Tesla to dominate the mid-range electric vehicle segment. But as support was pulled, consumers shifted to models from Ford, Hyundai, and European brands that enjoyed domestic incentives. This shows that Tesla is not just losing market share, but also forfeiting its strategic position in Canada's electric vehicle ecosystem. From my perspective, this is not just a subsidy cut. Canada is not only reducing its electricity exports, but is also quietly tightening its oil supply to the US, two critical factors for production operations. This leaves American automakers in a vulnerable position regarding energy inputs. Major companies like Ford have shifted their electric vehicle production lines to Mexico. GM is ramping up localization of parts in Ohio, while Stellantis has postponed investments in Michigan to redirect capital to Europe. Clear signs of a shift in manufacturing strategy, notably global. Competitors are capitalizing on the situation. China is accelerating its control over lithium resource in Africa. Canada is prioritizing subsidies for domestic companies. Meanwhile, Europe has significantly increased its domestic support budgets. At the same time, the prices of lithium and nickel, key battery materials, have risen by over 20% in just 6 months, according to Reuters benchmark. Minerals' US EV supply chains are disrupted and battery assembly timelines are delayed. This is no longer a technological issue, it's a strategic survival race. American automakers are caught in a tug-of-war between trade pressures and the expectations of a green transition to mitigate the impact of tariffs. And Canada's retaliatory actions. They have started ramping up investments in domestic battery technology, expanding electric vehicle research, and seeking to reduce reliance on imported materials. GM has announced plans to localize up to 80% of its electric vehicle parts 2026. While Ford is actively sourcing batteries from partners in South America. My analysis shows that the future of the US automotive industry heavily depends on restructuring supply chains, especially the links for lithium, nickel, and cobalt resources that are under price pressure and largely controlled by China in the upstream market. If these supply chains aren't localized or diversified quickly enough, American manufacturers will continue to be reactive to global shifts, but more importantly, it's the mindset of American consumers. As the government has less room to provide subsidies, automakers will also struggle to maintain the deep promotions they once offered. Prices of new vehicles are starting to rise, while choices are becoming more limited due to supply delays. If I were to predict US consumers will react negatively, they might delay purchasing new vehicles or switch to foreign brands if the prices are more competitive. I believe the combination of higher prices, fewer promotions, and limited choices will weigh heavily on the US middle class consumer market, which is the main driver of annual car sales. According to Business Insider, in just one weekend, Tesla sold 8,600 vehicles at 4 dealerships. That's one car every 30 seconds, a number that made the government raise questions. Is this real demand, or is it a strategy to drain the budget before the deadline? Electric Autonomy CA once reported that Tesla sold a compliance version of the Model 3 with a low range to bypass subsidy price requirements. After receiving the funds, the company stopped selling this. Strategy has outsmarted the system for years, but this time Canada responded publicly. Minister Chrystia Freeland made it clear as long as the US maintains the tariff, Tesla will no longer be eligible for subsidies. In my view, this is the first time a government has declared that access to subsidies will depend on trade relations, not technology. The consequences of Canada's decision extend beyond just dry numbers. According to Business Insider, Tesla's sales in Quebec, one of its largest markets in Canada, plummeted by over 85% in a single quarter from 5,097 vehicles to just 524. This isn't a typical decline. It's an alarming sign of rapidly eroding consumer confidence in a brand once considered a leader in the electric vehicle industry, according to Electric Autonomy CA. The value of used Tesla vehicles in Canada also dropped by an average of 21.9% compared to the previous year for consumers who had invested tens of thousands of dollars in an electric vehicle. This is a financial shock they were not prepared for. Not only have new vehicle prices risen due to the loss of subsidies, but even purchased assets are plummeting in value. A double blow to consumer trust from my perspective. This is no longer just a matter for one car manufacturer. It's a clear example of the ripple effect that trade policies and geopolitical tensions can have on the civilian market. When consumer confidence in a new technology like electric vehicles is shaken, it's not just one brand that suffers, it's an entire industry in transition that must bear the consequences. From my analysis, the greatest risk doesn't lie with Tesla. It lies with the US automotive manufacturing sector. Canada has begun cutting back on oil and electricity exports, two vital resources for factories in industrial states like Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. Ford, GM, and Stellantis are now forced to find alternatives importing energy from the Middle East or increasing domestic investments. But this is not cheap. Meanwhile, companies from Europe and China are seizing the opportunity to push cheaper products into the US market. The supply of nickel and lithium traditionally sourced from Canada is running low. Battery assembly plants are being forced to delay schedules. Some production lines have shifted to Mexico, while others have frozen their EV plans. The entire supply chain is losing its stability. If the trade conflict continues to escalate, the US automotive industry could lose its position in the global EV race, not due to a technological shortcoming, but because it's being cut off from essential resources. Supply chain without Canada. Meanwhile, trade partners from Brazil to Mexico to Germany realized that the US was no longer a politically safe destination, and they were forced to look elsewhere. Canada, which is still part of the USMCA agreement, with reliable industrial infrastructure, a stable legal system, and notably no retaliatory tariffs, suddenly became a strategic alternative. In my analysis, this isn't just a tariff conflict. It's a long-term trust test in international trade relations, and instead of the US being the stabilizing leader, it is acting as a supply chain risk. What the press isn't making clear: when businesses choose Canada, they aren't just avoiding tariffs, they're reshaping the global operating map. A map where the US is no longer the sole center. Every car part produced in Shaw, shipped through Vancouver, assembled in Windsor, and then sold in Chicago is raising a new question: who really controls the value chain? From this perspective, in my view, Canada's rise isn't a lucky break. It's the result of three factors: 1, consistent and open policies; 2, scalable industrial infrastructure; and 3, a favorable geopolitical location for accessing both the US and global markets. While the US uses tariffs as a barrier, Canada uses standards and reliability as a draw. These are two completely different approaches to economic development in the 21st century scene, and one of them is being chosen by the rest of the world. In March 2018, President Trump first imposed a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum. Even though Canada was America's top trade ally, it was included in the list. At that time, Ottawa responded with a retaliatory tariff of $12.8 billion, mainly targeting US goods like meat, beer, and motorcycles. But back then, production lines kept running thanks to the momentum of trust. US companies still believed in time that policies might change. However, that didn't happen. From 2018 to 2025, protectionist policies didn't just persist, they expanded. And when the steel and aluminum tariffs doubled to 50% in June 2025, trust was shattered. No international company could plan long-term in such an unpredictable environment. Canada quietly had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Ports bilateral agreements to Ohio. Once Canada proves its logistics role, the EU and Asia will prioritize bilateral relations rather than waiting on the US. This has happened before in the semiconductor industry, as I see it, when the US lost market share to Taiwan and South Korea in the 90s, and now with widespread tariffs, that risk is repeating itself with cars, batteries, and renewable energy. We might be standing at the dawn of an era where products made for America aren't made in America anymore. The US imposed tariffs to protect its supply chains, but perhaps those supply chains are moving to Canada. So the question is, in this global policy battle, who's really protecting domestic jobs?